The government inspector whose job it was to certify R101 airworthy had already decided it was not. He had written his concerns formally. He had declined to sign. And then, on the evening of October 4th, 1930, R101 lifted away from its mast at Cardington, England, carrying 54 people into a rain-soaked night over the English Channel. Because a cabinet minister had an imperial conference to attend in India, and the schedule would not wait for an airship that its own safety system had refused to clear. That is where this story begins. This is Failpoint. Tonight's report, R101. Britain in the late 1920s believed the future of long-distance travel was lighter than air. Not airplanes, airships. Massive, hydrogen-filled vessels that could carry passengers in cabin comfort across oceans and continents. The Air Ministry launched an ambitious parallel program. 2 airships, privately built R100 and state-built R101, competing to prove the concept. R101 was the government's machine, its prestige project. It was 777 feet long, the largest flying object ever constructed at that time. Failure was not considered a real option. That framing would shape every decision that followed. Lord Christopher Birdwood Thompson was Secretary of State for Air. He had championed R101 publicly and personally. He had also scheduled his own passage aboard the airship to India for the Imperial Conference in October 1930. Thompson wanted to arrive, as he reportedly said, like a viceroy. That date was fixed. It was not negotiable. And as R101's development ran into serious technical problems through 1929 and into 1930, the departure date did not move. A political deadline had quietly become the most powerful force in the airship's engineering timeline, more powerful than the test results. R101 had a fundamental structural problem that the engineers knew about and could not fully solve. The gas bags, the enormous fabric envelopes holding hydrogen inside the metal skeleton, were chafing against the framework. Think of a balloon slowly rubbing against a rough wall. Given enough time and movement, it punctures. R101's gas bags were doing exactly that, worn by contact with metal joints and wiring. Small tears meant slow hydrogen leaks. Slow leaks meant loss of lift. Loss of lift in a heavy, overpowered airship already struggling with its weight margins meant the ship could not safely sustain altitude. And this was known. Frederick McWade was the Air Ministry's Principal Aeronautical Inspector at Cardington. His job was independent certification, to stand between political ambition and public safety. He inspected R101 through 1930 and documented his concerns in formal reports. The gas bag chafing was unresolved. The structural modifications required by the ship's weight problems were inadequately tested, and the overall airworthiness in the original configuration was not established. McWade formally declined to issue the Certificate of Airworthiness. Not informally, not verbally. He declined in writing. This was the safety system functioning exactly as designed, and it was about to be circumvented. The response to McWade's refusal was not to fix the airship, it was to restructure the approval process. R101 underwent modifications, including a controversial insertion of an additional gas bag bay, lengthening the ship. But these changes were made rapidly, without the full flight test program that new modifications normally required. Then a permit to fly was issued by the Director of Civil Aviation, Sir William Sefton Brancker. A permit that was legally distinct from a Certificate of Airworthiness, but which allowed R101 to operate on its India route. McWade's refusal had been noted, recorded, and then, in practical effect, set aside. The airship would fly. R101 flew its first trial with the new configuration on October 1, 1930. One trial flight, 16 hours. The ship was declared satisfactory. 3 days later, it departed for India. The normal certification process for a modified airship of this complexity would have required weeks of systematic testing across different conditions, load configurations, and weather envelopes. R101 had none of that. What it had was a political deadline, a permit rather than a certificate, and the confidence of men who needed it to succeed. The weather forecast for the channel crossing that night was already poor. Rain, low cloud, moderate to fresh winds. The departure was not delayed. R101 crossed the English Channel and entered France at low altitude, lower than intended. Witnesses on the ground near Poix reported seeing the airship barely clearing the terrain. The ship was struggling. The gas bag leaks reduced hydrogen volume, which reduced lift, which forced the crew to run the engines harder to maintain height. But more engine power meant more fuel weight, which meant even less margin. It was a compounding trap. Each fix made the underlying problem slightly worse. By the time R101 reached the low hills of Beauvais in northern France, it was flying at perhaps 300 feet. For a vessel 777 feet long, that margin was almost nothing. At approximately 2:08 in the morning of October 5, 1930, R101 struck the ridge near Beauvais, France. The impact itself was survivable for many aboard. What was not survivable was what happened next. Hydrogen from ruptured gas bags ignited, almost certainly from an engine spark, though the official inquiry never conclusively established the ignition source. The fire consumed the ship in seconds. Of 54 people on board, 48 died. Lord Thompson died. Sir Sefton Branker died. The chief designer, Vincent Richmond, died. Frederick McWade, the inspector who had refused to certify the ship, was not aboard. He had remained at Cardington. The public inquiry, led by Sir John Simon, ran through early 1931. It was thorough in some respects and carefully limited in others. It documented the gas bag failures, the weight problems, the inadequate test program. What it did not do was formally assign personal responsibility to the officials who had bypassed McWade's certification refusal. The structural findings were clear. A gas bag forward of the control car had failed, causing a rapid loss of lift, a dive the crew could not arrest at that altitude. The ship hit the ground. The hydrogen ignited. The sequence was mechanical. The decision to fly was political. The inquiry recorded both, but only the first became the public narrative. What R101 teaches is precise and uncomfortable. The failure was not a gap in the safety system. It was a deliberate step over a line the safety system had drawn. McWade's refusal was the system working. The permit that replaced his certification was the system being worked around. Modern aviation safety is built partly on this lesson. Certification authority must be structurally independent of program pressure. An inspector who can be bypassed by a permit when a deadline is inconvenient is not an inspector. They are a formality. The distance between a certificate of airworthiness and a permit to fly is not administrative. It is, as Beauvais showed, the distance between safe and flying. 48 people died at Beauvais because a schedule mattered more than a signature. The R101 wreck lies buried in French soil. A memorial stands near the crash site. Frederick McWade's name is rarely mentioned in the popular accounts of the disaster. The stories tend to focus on the storm, the hill, the hydrogen. Those things were real. But McWade had already identified what would kill those people and had formally said so before the engines ever started. The system produced the right answer. The answer was ignored. Every failure has a point. Find it before it finds you. Next, the failure no inspector was allowed to see.